All right, thank you, Deb, and thank you to our panelists for the really insightful session. It's not easy to slog through the 3 o'clock hour. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage our final fireside chat as part of the 2024 Veterans Advanced Energy Summit. We'll have a fireside chat with former Secretary of Energy, the Honorable Dan Brouillette, and Lieutenant General Joseph McGee, but to lead that conversation will be Ali Rogan. Ali is a correspondent for the PBS NewsHour and PBS News Weekend and received a Peabody Award in 2021 for her work on NewsHour's series on the COVID-19 pandemic. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ali and Dan Brouillette and Lieutenant General McGee to the stage, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're between all of you and some cocktails, so we want to get right to it and make it worth your while. I know it's been a really fascinating, thought-provoking day, and I know that with this panel, we're going to finish out strong. With me is Dan Brouillette, who is president and CEO of the Edison Electric Institute, the association that represents all U.S. investor-owned electric companies. Prior to joining EEI, Mr. Brouillette served as president of Sempra Infrastructure, which specializes in the construction and operation of liquefied natural gas, export terminals, pipeline networks, and renewable electricity generation facilities. And prior to that, he served as the 15th U.S. Secretary of Energy. And Lieutenant General Joseph J.P. McGee, Director for Strategy, Plans, and Policy, J5, on the Joint Staff. He is responsible to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the nation's highest-ranking military officer and principal military advisor to the President, Secretary of Defense, and National Security Council. Prior to becoming the J5 Director, Lieutenant General McGee served as the Commanding General of the 101st Airborne Division in Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and to whom I will heretofore be referring as JP, only because he asked ahead of time.
I said it was okay.
He said it was okay. Otherwise I wouldn't. I first want to direct a question that I invite both of you to take. We're seeing in real time how climate change and energy needs are affecting national security. The victims of Hurricane Helene have been left without power, among other necessities, and thousands of National Guardsmen and women from different states have been deployed to support those recovery efforts, including in states that we didn't think were going to be affected by Hurricane Helene. These types of record-breaking disasters are becoming more common, so how do they affect planning in the military and in the energy sector, and how can both help to improve the response to future disasters?
You want me to start? Go ahead, sir.
Well, look, I think there's clearly a nexus here. When I think back in my time, which was very short in the Army, way back when, about 5 lifetimes ago, and I'm so honored to be sitting next to a general. Back when I was in the Army, they wouldn't let me within, 100 miles of a 3-star general, so it's quite an honor for me to be sitting. Look, I think, no one does this better than the military. And what I mean by that, no one understands resilience hardening better than the military. And, in the private sector, in the utility sector in particular, we are going through a series of capital investments that are doing much of the same work that the military has led for years and years and years. Hardening, adaptation, resilience of a transmission grid, of a pipeline network. Those are all important things that we need to do as American people, and our industry is doing it. But we've learned much of what we are doing today from the experiences that the General and others have shared with us over the years. We have signed MOUs with EEI and the Department of the Navy, as well as the Department of the Air Force, to do a lot of this work. We're seeing a lot of the technologies that are coming online today that have been part of that joint process. We are excited to see, for instance, Project Pele and some of the nuclear technologies that have come online, the smaller reactors being installed, or at least have the potential to be installed on military installations. All of this work is coming together and helping us to adapt to a changing climate, to adapt to a growing demand for electricity, both here in the United States and other parts of the world. So it's a very, very close collaboration, I would suggest, between the civilian utility sector, civilian electric power sector, and the United States military.
And I certainly want to talk more of that, about that. But JP, I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, on the fact that the energy sector has taken a lot of the cues from the military. Wonder how you see it.
If I could, maybe I'll frame it, what's happening with the energy sector and working with the military in light of all the global events that are happening. Because I think, as we were talking before we came in here, we really are living in times that maybe sometimes, because we're watching this happen day by day, we don't quite recognize the import of it. So, right now in Ukraine, the largest war in Europe since World War II is raging, and tens of thousands, if not more, hundreds of thousands have been killed or wounded. Okay, that's unimaginable a couple of years ago. In the last 5 months, Iran has attacked Israel with 2 waves of ballistic missile strikes. Again, if you had mentioned this 3 years ago, people would say, I mean, that's something that's never going to happen, and couldn't imagine. These things are happening simultaneously. So that's a bigger context around which all these weather-related impacts are driving stresses upon our forces. And so I'd say the military's always taken the environment into account. They've always taken the weather, because we operate 24/7 in all weather. But certainly all of these events, Hurricane Helene, which has now pulled about 1,000 active duty forces into North Carolina to support that, plus all those work in the National Guard. I think it's just going to continue to put increased demand on the joint force on top of all the other world events. And so we add that as an additional stressor to all of our requirements we're trying to juggle around the entire world.
Dan, you mentioned the lessons that the energy sector has learned from the military, but flipping that question around, how do those innovations in the energy sector help the military to be more resilient?
Well, I think, you think about the critical infrastructure in the United States. So all the military installations, with the exception of perhaps a handful, are served by private utilities here in the United States. So understanding that critical nature and the importance of that infrastructure is something that, the military, I think, has come to the civilian industry to learn more about. I got a chance as Secretary to visit a few, and when I looked at the resilience at some of the installations, candidly, it made me a bit anxious, to say the least. When the lights go off at an installation, I know the general has, commanded organizations like the 75th Ranger Battalion. If they lose, a regiment, if they lose power, they lose lights, and they have to deploy on a moment's notice, we're going to have a problem here in the United States. So I think that the military has learned the importance of energy while it is, in garrison. They clearly understand the importance of energy when they're deployed. And they have incredible abilities there, to set up mobile power stations and whatnot to keep the front line, the tip of the spear, fully powered. But it's here in the United States, when they're back in garrison, when they're back home, that we're beginning to see a closer and closer relationship between the civilian and the military community.
And to that end, Dan, if I can stay with you, you have spent time in the military. You've spent lots of time learning different areas of the energy sector. What skills do you think veterans bring specifically to these issues? Why are they so well suited to be a part of the energy sector, especially those who've served as first responders? Yeah,
well, I think all of the lessons that you learn, even as a junior enlisted person, private E1, as I was when I went in the military. The leadership lessons that you learn very early, and you're doing this at a very early age, they stay with you for a very long time. So when people leave the military and they come to organizations like EEI or one of our member companies in the utility space, that's the first thing that we notice. They tend to be more mature. They tend to be ready for advancement very quickly. They tend to be ready for leadership positions within our companies very, very quickly. So we appreciate that, and we look to that community for a pipeline of talent coming in. The technical skill sets, though, are also very, very impressive. If you're trained by the Army or by the Navy or by the Air Force in things like cybersecurity, we're going to be looking at you if you choose to leave the military, because that's something that is becoming more and more of an issue for us. It's, the adversary does not sleep, as the general said. So it's a 24/7 operation for us. Those are technical skill sets that we look for in our industry.
But you're only looking for those after they've extended tours in the military after.
He doesn't want to give them up. He doesn't want to give them up. And we look for folks. The U.S. Navy has hands down the best nuclear program in the world. And if you're trained as a Navy nuke, you have incredible skill sets that we're going to be looking for as well on the civilian side. So, that talent pipeline that we see coming out of the military is absolutely critical. But leadership skills, technical skills, and just the ability to act in the general mentioned the hurricane in North Carolina. We have roughly 50,000 utility workers from 41 states, I guess now, I misspoke. It used to be 27, and so I had 7 in my head. We're now up to 41 different states that have supplied over 50,000 workers. And these are first responders. I mean, they show up literally right after the storm has moved through. So they're moving toward the damage, toward the incident, not away from the incident. And it's that culture, it's that leadership, it's that understanding of a mission that is so important to our civilian industry as well. And we look to the military for that sort of training and that upbringing.
I'd like to pick up on something that Dan mentioned and ask you, JP. We've seen in theaters abroad energy infrastructure be vulnerable, come under attack. And I wonder, how does that play into? Is that playing a growing role in the mission of the military right now, defending these critical sites, particularly as we try to diversify our sources of energy?
Absolutely. I mean, you can certainly imagine us deploying to a number of locations where we would be relying upon the native energy infrastructure. It would be critical to the things that we're doing. The military has a great generative capability to be able to deploy that and do it, but it's always best if we can get it from the country where we're operating in. Although in any of these locations, just like within the United States, as the Secretary was discussing, this idea of resiliency and having multiple different layers of it is critically important. And so we see that, whether we're back here in the United States or whether we're deployed someplace else.
And I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about some of that resiliency and redundancy that these bases are building into their mode of operation. I know that you've seen much of this firsthand. Well,
as a base commander in my last job, I was at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I had a chance to really experience this. And the Secretary is right. A lot of our energy was coming from off-post, on-post, which is a great construct, but it wasn't the only way we got it. And so we were determining alternate methods, whether that was generative capacity that we had, whether it was a solar farm that we had established there, or other experiments that we were running to try to see how Fort Campbell could be energy independent. And I think we're in early stages of this across the entire Army or the DoD, but I think increasingly we're looking at trying to have resilient systems, maybe with excess capacity, that might be able to contribute back to communities as well, in case it's not all needed.
Yeah, that seems like such a fascinating element to me, the fact that you're developing these resiliency measures, but you can also give back to the community that you're in.
That's right.
At the same time. It's truly incredible. Dan, I'd like to ask you, let's talk a little bit more about the threats to military and civilian critical infrastructure here in the U.S. How is the energy sector helping support the protection of those assets as they become more of a potential vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope there aren't any kinetic threats anytime soon. What we see, perhaps more often is what we mentioned earlier. The cyber threat seems to be, very real and growing each day. The industry, I think, has done an admirable job of protecting the assets. I mean, we stay on top of the latest technologies. We are very aggressive in deploying those technologies, and as I mentioned earlier, bringing in the best talent to help us. The application of AI, looking at some other unique applications of things like quantum computing. We're looking at everything we can put our hands on in order to protect this infrastructure. Because as we've seen in Europe most recently and other parts of the world, energy really drives everything that we do. If we lose a pipeline here in the United States, we all know what happens to retail gasoline prices. If we lose power, obviously lives are impacted. As I like to tell folks when I speak to them publicly, it's energy makes up roughly 5% of the gross domestic product, if you will, the nation's GDP. But importantly, it's the first 5%, because everything else you do depends upon the provision of that energy. If you just think about your personal life, try charging your iPhone without electricity. Try paying your credit card bill without access to Wi-Fi. The things that we do, we have become so dependent upon this technology and upon electricity in particular that it's important that we protect it. So those are the things, really cyber is the thing that I see the most acute. I'm from Louisiana, so from New Orleans, it's the alligator closest to the boat, and that's the one that we tend to pay a lot of attention to.
And I would just say, I think in the military, the National Guard's got a great role to play within that in terms of being able to identify, do surveys and reconnaissance of critical infrastructure within the states under the authorities they already have working for the governors. And I think they've got capacity and a willingness. I remember when I worked at Army Cyber watching what California was doing with the California National Guard, where they were doing a number of important pieces of work to determine exactly what the lay of the land of these networks were, how they were interconnected as a baseline to be able to make them more resilient and better defended.
When you talk about cyber, I am curious, and I wonder, this is not something that I let either of you know I was going to ask about, but it just brings it up. The fact that we're relying so much more on AI, we're relying on data centers, which are taking up an increasing amount of real estate around the country, an increasing amount of infrastructure that's required. How are energy companies dealing with these challenges? Because somebody's got to keep the lights on in these data centers.
Somebody's got to keep the lights on. Yeah, no, it's you're absolutely correct. I mean, for us, I'll just call it for ease, simplicity, a three-legged stool. I mean, for us, the challenge is to make the system resilient and reliable. It's to make it clean, and importantly, it's to make it affordable. So it's really a three-legged stool: resilience, environmental stewardship, and affordability for consumers. And that's been a challenge that we've had for 100+ years, but I think the industry does a really good job with it. As we think about those data centers that you mentioned, it's increasing the load here in the United States, or has the potential to increase the load by an enormous amount. I've read some reports that said data centers alone could comprise roughly 10% of the nation's electricity capacity. It's an enormous amount of electricity. It's an enormous load, but it's not unprecedented load. And that's something that I think the American people need to understand too as we read these stories. We don't get too anxious or worried about our ability to do this. We know how to do this. There was a time in American history back in the 1950s when we used a process known as gaseous diffusion to enrich uranium to make nuclear warheads. And that was done in about 2 or 3 different facilities here in the United States: Oak Ridge, Paducah, Kentucky. That process alone consumed 10% of the nation's electricity grid. And we learned how to meet that load very effectively. TVA, private entities around the country, developed generation, built transmission, built things, built infrastructure to allow us to meet that. And that's what we need to do again today as we think about AI, think about the importance of keeping that technology here in the United States. It's going to be important that we address things like permitting. Can we build things here in the United States? If we say yes to that, then we will meet the load, we will keep the lights on, and we will do it in the cleanest manner known possible.
JP, I'd like to ask you about how climate, which obviously is inextricable from energy when we talk about it, is affecting areas of operation. We had talked about the Lake Chad region, which I think is a fascinating example of how climate change is truly changing the literal and figurative terrain.
It's an interesting case study of how all of these changes are impacting actually just the Earth and where we operate in terms of military operations or how governance is looked at globally. Lake Chad Basin, the amount of water between 1960 and now, I mean, in 1960 there was a full-blown massive lake there in the heart of Africa, and now it's gone. And so imagine over that period of time, all of a sudden, that huge expanse of land never being part of anybody's land boundaries, never being part of any of their jurisdictions, never being part of the way this area was governed. So all of a sudden, in this critical region in the Sahel, you've now got a vast ungoverned spaces and what flows into there. Terrorism, criminals, others who use this ungoverned space as an opportunity, all created by the fact that, again, 30, 40 years ago, there was water in the lake there. It was uninhabitable, but now it is. And so I think we're seeing this. That's a huge manifestation, but I think we're seeing more and more the impacts of all of these changes on how we're conducting our military operations.
Absolutely fascinating. We're going to turn to questions in a few minutes. So if you do have a question, please start thinking about it. I believe there's a microphone in the room. You guys have been here longer than I have, so you know the drill. And there will be questions solicited from an iPad as well. So for those of you watching online, you can submit questions. But I'd like to to ask both of you to weigh in on the role that supply chains play in your industry and your institution. The fact that since COVID, there have been all sorts of disruptions to global supply chains, and there have been varying degrees of adaptation, resilience, response to those disruptions. I mean, we're seeing one as we literally speak with the strikes happening in ports around the United States. But what can the energy sector and the military do to become more resilient to these disruptions and also to protect the existing global supply chains if that is what the situation requires?
So I think we're seeing it play out right now in a really interesting fashion with what the Houthis are doing across the Bab el-Mandeb. Bab el-Mandeb, always identified as a strategic strait, leads into the Suez Canal through which 10 to 20% of the world's trade was flowing before the Houthis decided to start launching missiles at the ships that pass through there. I think what's really worth highlighting is because of a whole confluence of reasons to include, after COVID, there was much more resiliency built into the supply chains. The shipping industry has more ships. There was a brief adjustment. There was a few weeks worth of disruption, but effectively most shipping companies have just routed all commerce around Africa. However long that time difference was, 3 to 4 weeks was the only amount of the disruption of the chain that you felt. And then the other piece, and again, who knew these things? I didn't know until I came into this job. You had to deal with this situation. Shipping costs for any commercial good is normally a penny or two on the dollar. And that additional routing around Africa only added an additional penny or two to every one of them. So it wasn't, a 30% rise in consumer goods and all of these. And so I think we're now re-examining the nature of strategic straits, what supply chains are, the global shipping industry, and how robust and resilient it is. And I think, we're seeing as the industries change in the face of these challenges, where there are opportunities, where there truly are risks. I would never suggest that not all straits are not significant. I would argue the Strait of Hormuz, through which a whole bunch of oil travels, is still tremendously strategic. But to me, at least, one of the things that was really fascinating is how resilient that global shipping network was and how quickly they adjusted to it, with minimal impact to the economy, except for the economies of Egypt and Jordan and those who are directly related to the Suez Canal.
No, that's all true. I didn't think about it in that context. You're right. I mean, the additional shipping cost is at the margin, I suppose. Mm-hmm. With regard to manufacturing capacity, I think that's really one of the things that we like to talk about, in the civilian electrical business. The production, the manufacture of things like transformers, other bulk power, critical components. I think it's important for us to develop that capability here in the United States. So much of that's moved overseas. And because of the doctrinal changes in places like China and other places, I think we're much more sensitive to where we're buying these products from than perhaps we have been in recent times. And that's a good thing. So I think what Congress has done to incentivize some of the manufacturing or make it easier here or make it more incentivize the production of those activities here in the United States, I think is a good thing. And we're going to be supporting that as an industry as well. So when we look at the infrastructure bill that was passed in Congress, or perhaps some components of the Inflation Reduction Act, those tax credits, we're going to be very supportive of some of those because we want to see those capabilities come back here to the United States to alleviate the supply chain risks that we currently face.
I want to conclude this part of the conversation with a more 1,000-foot question, which is, you both represent very big institutions that sometimes can be hard to change.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I don't know. That's I know that.
Never in a million years.
The Lieutenant General has no idea about any of this. But how do you balance the institutional heft that comes with the jobs that you're in, with the need to innovate?
Well, we're a little different, I suppose. Obviously, a lot different than the military, but nonetheless, we're in a regulated industry. So I'll just speak to the civilian utility or power company industry. Again, that three-legged stool really does matter. It's it's the ability to do all of this, to innovate, to produce power, to do all the things that you need to do, but to do it affordably, because that's where the state regulators really have an important role to play. They have to ensure that these costs are not borne by consumers in very dramatic fashion. So we tend to do things over a very long period of time. We look at these capital investments in decades, not in days or in weeks, and that's important for us to do as a country. I do think that as I think about what has happened in this industry, it's amazing. I mean, when you take a look at what we've done here in the United States, for instance, we've grown the economy by roughly 20% over the course of the last, call it a decade, call it 15 years. And at the same time, we've reduced emissions from energy sources by roughly 17%. And that's due to innovation. So while we can say, yeah, it's a big, organization and it's hard to move, and sometimes it is, there's no question about that. It is quite nimble when it comes to certain elements of the energy business. And I'm very proud to be a part of it, very proud of what they've been able to do. And they've done it all while keeping the lights on 99.99999% of the time. Mm-hmm. So it's a great industry.
So 2 jobs ago, I worked for the Army in the field of how we develop our officer corps and our leaders broadly, and what we identified was that this idea of innovation and instilling this in all of our leaders is absolutely critical, because if we imagine a future in which we're fighting whatever the next war will be, we've got our vision of what it's going to be. We know we will be wrong between the reality of future combat and what we're projecting and training our people. And the element or the side that can close that gap most rapidly through innovative leaders who can read the battlefield, figure that out, and then drive those sort of changes are the one that's going to succeed. And this was years before Ukraine, but we're watching this play out on the battlefield in Ukraine. Ukraine, much smaller, much more innovative. Look what they're doing with one-way attack drones. Look what they're doing in a number of non-standard employment of the equipment that we have provided, from all around the world to support that. And that element of innovation is absolutely critical to overcome the challenges of a future battlefield. Now the question becomes, how do you do that in peacetime? How do you do that with a large bureaucratic organization? And I just say it's hard work. It's really got to come top down. It's got to come bottom up, and there's got to be a mixture. And where it almost always has its most difficulty is in what we call that frozen middle, in the middle of people who don't want to change. And so you can have an innovative chief and you can have innovative soldiers at the lower level, but if there's something in the middle that's slowing it, and so there's a lot of energy and attention that needs to be focused on driving those changes across organizations that are not necessarily, they're just bureaucratic and slow, sometimes out of necessity, because you've got to be bureaucratic if you're going to be a 1.2 million person army. You've got to have something to run that. That also hinders sometimes your speed of innovation.
Let's turn to some questions online. Again, if you do want to ask questions, go to askac.org. That's askac.org. Let's start with a question from Christina Tamayo. What's the biggest obstacle to creating a resilient and economic grid? How can the military contribute to this effort domestically? We talked a lot about hardening military assets, and I'd like to hear what more can be done domestically.
Currently, I think the biggest obstacle is the processes around permitting here to get infrastructure built. I mean, that's been a challenge for our industry, and I'm sure for other industries as well. So it's something that Congress has begun to address. They had some first steps that were taken in a recent debt bill that they passed, and I know that there's a bill pending now before the Senate Energy Committee with Senators Barrasso and Manchin as the lead sponsors. Those are steps I think we have to take here in the United States to make it easier so that we can build out infrastructure. I'll just share one quick story. When I was the president of Semper Infrastructure, we were building LNG export facilities and pipelines, as you mentioned earlier. And in the process of going to what is called a final investment decision on a major LNG export facility, I had to raise a few $1 billion in a short amount of time in order to get this project over the line and approved by the board and put shovels in the ground. Over that course of, 6 months to a year of raising that money, not once did I ever get asked by a banker, if we lend you the money, are you going to pay us back? They never asked that question. What they asked was, do you have a permit? Can you get a permit? And that was the basis for their confidence in our ability to get this project built. And it's just an indication that it is a crucial problem here in the United States. So I think, if we're willing to address that as a nation, if Congress finds, the consensus it needs to move those bills forward, I think we're going to be okay.
Would you like to weigh in on that, JP? Or shall we
It's
go?
a little bit outside my expertise, but I do think there is tremendous opportunities in the military, civilian, across the numerous installations we run as the Department of Defense, both here and around the world, to be able to build resiliency and efficiencies, I think.
CP Smith asks, true resiliency is achieved through layers of resiliency. What paradigm do you conceptually use to pressure test just how many layers of resiliency are needed? And who pays for those extra layers of resiliency?
Paradigm's a big word. E1s don't use words like that, so maybe I'll let the general start with that.
Lieutenant generals don't normally either. At least this one doesn't. Yeah. So within the energy sector, I'm not sure I could. I'd have to defer to the secretary. But I just think, in terms of a framework, we live in a world where if it can go wrong, it's going to go wrong. That's Murphy's Law, pretty simple. I mean, everybody understands that in the military, and I think you've got to take that at the higher levels. That you can't assume that one exquisite technological solution isn't going to have issues. It's not going to have to flip to a second or a third. And so I think that's probably the framework. Probably one level of redundancy, resiliency is not enough. 2 layers probably is, and then a rapid regenerative capacity once you identify, your primary and alternate issues.
The general's absolutely right. I mean, we see that in the civilian side as well. So, I mean, we think about things like renewable power, for instance. We're moving to a cleaner and cleaner production world of electrons. So we're using more and more renewable power, but we all realize that renewable power without appropriate grid scale, long duration battery backup will not provide all of the power that we need to meet AI demand or increased industrial load that is coming on. So we're working very hard to develop what's called base load or firm power, keeping these installations on that run 24/7 that give us the backup capacity we need when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine and we're not able to generate those electrons with renewable power. So it is a very layered approach, if you will, to the production of electricity.
This question is from Anonymous, so love your book. We haven't truly had a major conflict where we've been challenged as a nation since World War II, where we had concerns about domestic attacks, rationing, and had to divert resources from domestic consumption to defense needs. How prepared do you believe our nation is to meet energy demands at home as well as overseas associated with great power competition and conflict? What practical and strategic steps can we take now to elevate readiness?
Yeah, I think it's. I got it. I think so.
I think that's yours.
I think that one's for you.
Well, it's a great question. Anonymous probably should identify him or herself, because that's a fantastic question. And I think, it is one of those, as I talked in the beginning, we talk about the unprecedented nature of the things that are happening around the world. And I don't think anyone was predicting that, but I do think we need to start having conversations with, domestic leaders, governors, and others about what this potentially could look like. You take a look at, for example, what is happening right now in Ukraine and the way the Russians are aggressively targeting their critical national infrastructure, not just to break down their industry and not just to prevent them from being able to run businesses, but really to be able to break the will of the Ukrainian people to want to continue this fight. And that linkage is very strong, and I think the Russians identify, which is why you'll see every winter they pick up their strikes against critical national infrastructure within Ukraine to make it less hospitable for Ukrainians to reside in Ukraine. It's not unimaginable in a global war that an adversary would try to strip away these same capabilities to make us lose our will. And I think it's a little bit scary, and frankly, but I think it's a necessary conversation. But if you, again, look at what's happening in Ukraine, things like national industry, national will, the willingness to be able to fight and sacrifice for a conflict are things that we really haven't talked about at a national level since World War II. And I'm not predicting that we're right there yet, but it might be worthwhile to start having some conversations where these topics are at least put out there as potentials.
That's true.
This question, I cannot speak to the premise, so I invite you to weigh in on it as well. But John asks, How do you inspire urgency in strengthening the resilience of our energy systems, whether civilian or military, when markets remain so significantly stable in the face of the most significant war in Europe in 80 years, coinciding with growing hostilities between Iran, Israel, et cetera?
That's a great question. To think about that for a second. How do we inspire, did you say urgency?
Yeah, a sense of urgency, because it seems like the markets are, kind of plugging along,
I think that's a good thing, though. I mean, the fact that we have, at least here in the United States, open markets, which send important price signals, I think that's important. That stability is actually a good sign, perhaps not a bad sign, is my initial reaction to that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be vigilant and, thinking about, what the general just discussed and what others have thought about as well on a daily basis. But I see that stability, I see that sense of certainty over a long period of time as a positive, not a negative.
I would just, as the Director of Plans and Policies, I think all of these challenges become harder to surmount if we haven't thought through the plans or what the ramifications would be, or having a construct by which we would address some of these issues. And so creating a sense of urgency might be hard, but not creating a plan and not creating a common understanding of how we might execute a plan in case there was a need for urgency. Because in my experience, at every level I've been in the Army, it's always worse to create a plan like in the middle of the crisis as opposed to pulling something off the shelf that has been thoughtfully put together.
Absolutely. Anonymous asks, I'm not sure if this is the same Anonymous or a different one, but that there is huge diversity of the risks and opportunities in the energy sector and national security space. How do we prioritize, how and what do we prioritize in a world of rapid technological change and relentless political cycles? How do we cut through the noise?
How do we cut through the noise? That's another hard question. Look, I think we prioritize, in our space, in the civilian side of this, we go back again to that regulatory compact that we have with the American people. The agreement that we have in the utility space is to keep the lights on and to keep it affordable. That is first and foremost, and that's our priority. In addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, we do things in an environmentally sound and sensible way. So we combine that, but that is our North Star, and that is what drives our investment. It's what drives our our people day in and day out. That's the mission in which they have chosen to serve. So that really does become the driving force behind every decision we make or every plan that we put together.
And JP, the theaters that the military is operating in are constantly evolving, and warfare is constantly changing. From a broad perspective, how do you think of planning when the terrain, when the weapons, when the systems, when the fighters are changing all the time?
Well, I think, in those sort of constructs where it's going to be rapidly changing, you've got to invest in the things that are not going to change or are requiring to be able to be adaptive. And really, I think that speaks a lot to leadership, right? Because no matter what that is, whatever happens, even with the increased levels of autonomy we're starting to see with some of these things coming out of Ukraine, I think you're still going to have a cadre of leaders and people who are forced to conduct these operations. And so across the military, all the services, we invest a ton of work into the development of our people to get them ready for not just the jobs that they do in a technical fashion, but the next few jobs. And this idea that you're training a captain up to do the job of a lieutenant colonel, and then you've got that depth in the leadership ranks, so if that happens, they can fairly seamlessly move up and do that. I think that's foundational to all the things that we're doing in a world that's changing. And then you instill a sense of innovation, and then you try to have those scouts out there who are seeing how things are changing so they can feed it back to our organization so we can adapt in time. I think those are all really important factors. And then don't forget, though, the military doesn't exist just to innovate. And, daily we are doing operations around the world, and that consumes a huge portion of our energy and effort, as it should. And so this is always something we're doing generally on top of, sometimes in institutions that are really just focused on that. But it's always this combination of current operations, future readiness that we're trying to balance.
Yeah, and it's that split screen that really just, it's so stunning and fascinating when you really think about everything that is happening simultaneously. Dan, this question I think seems to be something that I'll pose to you. Ben B asks, in deregulated regions, the economics to make the necessary investments in infrastructure continue to be challenged while private equity-backed IPPs are looking to step away from fossil generation. Will deregulated generation deliver the capacity needed for economic growth?
It's a great question. We're starting to see some challenges in the deregulated markets now. What's called PJM in the mid-Atlantic region of the U.S. There was a capacity auction there. For those who are not familiar how those work, in the deregulated or what's called deregulated markets, people have auctions for electrons, and companies are separated, so you can't own both the generation and the distribution or the transmission elements of a network, so they're separated. And the wires companies, as we refer to them, buy electrons in an auction market. The last capacity auction that just occurred in that region, the pricing was 10 times greater than it was just a year ago. And there's going to be a new auction, I guess, coming in a few weeks or perhaps a month or so, a little bit more than that. And the expectation is that the prices will go even higher. Now, you can look at this from a market standpoint and say, well, those are great, important signals for people. Given the high prices, you would think that investment would come in to build more generation. That's true, perhaps more true in a classroom than it is in the real world. It's economic theory. I'm not going to argue with it. It's true. The challenge we're seeing, though, is what I mentioned earlier. It's nice to have the price signal up there, but you still have to get permits to build the generation. You still have to get access to things like natural gas to provide firm baseload power. And it's a dynamic that we're seeing play out most acutely in this part of that, the country. So in the mid-Atlantic region, Pennsylvania, Maryland, West Virginia, parts of West Virginia. We're going to have to wait and see, I think, for another couple of weeks or months how this plays out. I am somewhat concerned that we're not going to get the amount of generation we need to meet the load that we talked about earlier. I think it's important for regulators in that part of the world to really study the market signals that are being sent. More importantly, to see what is the reaction to the market signal and then develop consensus really quickly, if necessary, to change some of those market structures. That's going to be important for them in that region. We have other regions of the country that are facing similar situations, what's called MISO, which is in the middle part of the country, and then we have one out in California as well. Things are beginning to change very rapidly in this utility or power industry. We're just going to have to keep a close eye on it.
This betrays my ignorance, but are we talking about actual auctions like paddles and things like that? Like
sort of.
Yeah. All right.
It looks more like the stock market on any given day than it does people standing in line with paddles.
I have another question that I think also, Dan, you might be best placed to weigh in on. But Jason Knapp asks, how can we create incentives for utility companies to build out power infrastructure in advance of critical demand? Again, talking about anticipation. The goal would be to accelerate the process of setting up energy-intensive manufacturing facilities, such as those producing photovoltaic and battery cells.
Well, again, I think the industry does a great job of exactly that. So, the growth in the utility space or in electricity demand over the course of the last 20 years has been about 2%, 2.5% per year. So for relatively stable. And the reason it's been relatively stable is that we've been innovating to produce technologies around energy efficiency. So it's not just adding energy all the time. We use electricity, we use energy much more efficiently here in the United States today than we did 2 decades ago or 3 decades ago. But it's been relatively stable. So what we talked about earlier with this increase in demand coming on, and I've seen projections that are roughly 4.5%, perhaps even 5 or 6% growth. You think about that, what that means. That's 5 or 6% growth over a much larger economy than we had 40 years ago when we used to have 5% growth. So it's a big demand uptick. It's almost exponential in certain ways, or in certain parts of the country. The industry has planned for that, however. These are not things that are completely a surprise to this industry. But again, because we're in a regulated environment, it's important for consumers to be able to afford those investments to allow this industry to meet that incredible demand that's coming. So, we're going to work closely with the regulators and have them balance the equation in a way that's effective for the consumers and for the respective service areas in which each of our companies operate. But I think the industry has done a really good job of planning ahead for this growth. So we'll meet it. We'll meet the challenge. We'll see it as an opportunity, and the country will thrive.
Richard Bell asks a great closing question for both of you. What risk or opportunity are we not spending enough time thinking about in our energy and national security planning?
You want me to start?
Go ahead.
I think, I think, when I think about risk, we can think about climate risk, we can think about economic growth as a potential risk. For me, when I think about, this industry, it's talent. It's the pipeline of people coming into the industry. I don't think, we're doing enough in America, either through our education system, through our technical training programs, to develop the talent we're going to need 2 and 3 and 4 decades from now. So to me, that's an enormous risk. I mean, and that's why I mentioned earlier, we look to the veteran community. We look to the military for that pipeline in many, many cases. And today, if you look at, I think the latest number, somewhere around 6% of the energy industry is comprised of veterans, people with military service in their history. In the electricity sector, it's probably closer to 10%. And we want to do a more aggressive job of bringing in that talent into our industry. Because if we're going to meet this demand, if we're going to develop the innovative technologies that are necessary for us to do this, it's probably going to come from people that have your experience, the military experience.
I'll just say very succinctly, I think one of the greatest opportunities is something that's happened right under our nose, and I think you all probably understand it, but a lot of people don't, which is we've achieved energy independence. We are a net exporter of energy, and what that frees up for us strategically in terms of dependencies under multiple different future scenarios gives us an incredible position of strength that wasn't existing. I think as early as 30 years ago when I was commissioned, that was not the case.
Fascinating. Well, Lieutenant General McGee and Dan Brouillette, thank you so much for a fascinating, thought-provoking conversation.
Thank you.